Why do nearly 20 years of Jesus simply vanish from history, disappearing between childhood and the moment he steps into the world at 30? Why do the scriptures fall silent about those years, leaving behind a gap so vast that the absence itself feels overwhelming, a silence so heavy it becomes almost deafening? For centuries, we've been told those years were unremarkable, that nothing important happened, that they don't matter. But what if that explanation has always felt wrong to you, because, deep down, you've always sensed it was incomplete? Think about it. A man does not emerge from total obscurity at 30 and suddenly speak with a clarity and authority powerful enough to shake human consciousness, reshape history, and challenge empires, unless something profound happened first, hidden from view, forged quietly in the shadows. So, what was really happening during those lost years? Was Jesus living a simple, uneventful life in the villages of Galilee, learning a trade and waiting for destiny to arrive? Or was he moving through the ancient world, seeking wisdom far beyond the borders of his homeland, studying traditions that later generations would never want associated with his name? There are whispers of him walking the sacred temples of Egypt, absorbing ancient mysteries, of sitting with mystics in India, learning teachings of compassion and inner awakening, of studying healing practices among the Essenes, a secretive brotherhood near the Dead Sea. Some even claim he traveled as far as Tibet, where stories still speak of a holy man from the West who came searching for truth. And in the green hills of Glastonbury, legends tell of a young Jesus crossing the seas with traders, leaving echoes that would later entwine with the myths of the Holy Grail. If even a fragment of these stories is true, then the version of Jesus you were taught is only part of a much larger picture. And if the world built its faith on only half the story, imagine what happens when the rest is finally heard, like the pause between the notes of a beautiful song. There is a quiet idea that has followed humanity across centuries, an idea so unsettling that it rarely gets spoken aloud. What if the most important transformations never happen in the light, but in the spaces where no one is looking? What if silence itself is not absence, but a veil? This question sits at the heart of the mystery surrounding Jesus, and it begins with a gap so familiar that it has almost become invisible. When you open the New Testament, the story flows clearly at first. A child astonishes scholars in the temple. Then, without warning, the narrative stops. From around the age of 12 until 30, nearly 2 decades vanish. No teachings, no journeys, no recorded struggles, just an expanse of quiet so complete that it has echoed for 2,000 years. Tradition has told us those years were simple, uneventful, not worth remembering. Years of labor, of anonymity, of waiting. Yet something in that explanation has always felt thin, as if it were covering something rather than revealing it. You may not have had words for it, but you've likely felt it. A life capable of igniting revolutions of thought, of unsettling empires, of speaking directly to the deepest core of the human soul, does not simply appear fully formed. It does not come out of nowhere. Something happens before that moment, something unseen, something formative. Across cultures and across time, the lives of great teachers follow a strange and consistent rhythm. Before the voice that moves the world, there is almost always a long wandering. Before the public awakening, there is a private descent. Pilgrimages across deserts and mountains, years spent listening more than speaking, seeking wisdom where it still burns quietly, protected from crowds and power. When we look at this pattern, a question naturally arises, not as an accusation, but as a curiosity. Why would Jesus be the exception? Beyond the familiar texts, beyond the carefully preserved canon, there exist other fragments, half-remembered stories, traditions passed in whispers rather than proclamations. Apocryphal writings, some hidden, some lost, some dismissed, speak of initiations and teachings that were never meant for public record. In the valleys of Kashmir, there are long-standing legends of a teacher called Isa, a man from the West who studied with sages and learned the language of inner liberation. In Tibetan accounts, there are references to a young seeker who came to learn the Dharma, only to disappear again toward his homeland. Near the Dead Sea, the Essenes lived apart from the world, devoted to purification, healing, and communion with unseen realms, guarding their knowledge within a closed circle. Their practices, their symbols, their vision of inner transformation carry an uncanny resonance with words that would later be spoken openly in Judea. These stories are not presented as proof, and they do not need to be. They exist in a liminal space, neither fully claimed nor fully erased, hovering at the edge of accepted history. And that alone invites another question, one quieter but far more uncomfortable. If these ideas were harmless, why did they fade from the official story? Why did silence become the chosen response? One possible answer has little to do with truth and much to do with order. If Jesus had drawn from Egypt, from India, from Persia, from traditions far older and wider than any single institution, then his message could no longer belong to one structure, one authority, one gatekeeper. It would place him within a vast, universal stream of wisdom that flows beneath all religions, dissolving boundaries rather than reinforcing them. For systems built on separation and control, such a vision is destabilizing. Silence, then, becomes useful, not to preserve mystery, but to manage it. And yet, not everything could be buried. When you listen closely to the teachings attributed to Jesus, you begin to hear echoes. His language of sowing and reaping mirrors ancient understandings of cause and consequence, of inner cycles that shape outer reality. His healings resemble methods known in other cultures, where transformation begins not with the body, but with awareness. His sharp rejection of worldly power aligns with Gnostic visions of false rulers, forces that dominate through illusion rather than truth. Seen this way, the missing years do not look empty at all. They begin to resemble a crucible, a place of refinement where a human being is stripped, tested, and reshaped, a time not of disappearance, but of preparation. This reframes the mystery in a way that feels closer to the bone. If those years were a time of learning, of initiation, of inner discipline, then the story is no longer only about what Jesus did or where he went. It becomes about what kind of consciousness he returned with, and that realization quietly destabilizes another assumption. If wisdom can be gathered across cultures, if truth is not owned but remembered, then no single book or authority holds a monopoly on meaning. Traditions begin to look less like competing truths and more like tributaries feeding the same ancient river. At this point, the question turns gently, almost imperceptibly, toward you. Because the lost years are no longer just a historical puzzle. They become a mirror. They ask where you search for truth and who you allow to define its boundaries. They suggest that the path to understanding may not run through loud declarations or public approval, but through periods of obscurity that feel, from the outside, like nothing at all. The silence of Scripture, in this light, is not a dead end. It is a map, pointing away from the obvious and toward the forbidden edges of knowing, toward the places where questions are more important than answers, and seeking matters more than belonging. If those hidden years shaped the words that would later unsettle the world, then something was forged there, something subtle yet powerful enough to endure centuries of suppression. What practices, what inner transformations, what ways of seeing emerged in that quiet? The answers are not handed to us, they are hinted at, felt, rather than stated. And perhaps that is the point. Because the moment you begin to sense that silence is not empty, but alive, you are already stepping into the mystery itself, standing at the threshold of a story that is not finished, but unfolding. That sense of standing at a threshold deepens when we look not at what was written, but at how the teachings later appeared. After years of silence, Jesus does not return with scrolls or doctrines carved in stone. He does not present a system to memorize or a hierarchy to obey. Instead, he speaks in stories, parables about seeds and soil, lamps and oil, lost coins and hidden treasure. On the surface, they sound simple, almost ordinary. Yet beneath that simplicity lies something deliberately elusive, as if the meaning were designed to slip past the grasp of anyone listening only with their intellect. This choice is not accidental. Across ancient mystery traditions, the most potent knowledge was never delivered directly. It was wrapped in symbol, gesture, and paradox, revealed only to those who were ready to feel their way into it. In Egypt, initiates were sworn to secrecy, taught through images and rituals rather than explanations. In India, teachings of inner liberation were passed from teacher to student, guarded by silence as much as by words. Among the Essenes, wisdom unfolded gradually, layer by layer, within a closed community. When viewed through this lens, the parables are no longer a teaching tool for the masses. They are a signal, a quiet recognition between those who know how to listen. Consider one phrase that has echoed across centuries: "The kingdom of God is within you." To someone seeking external salvation, it sounds poetic, even comforting. But to someone trained in inner disciplines, it lands like a revelation. It dismantles the idea that truth lives in temples, institutions, or distant heavens. It points inward, toward consciousness itself. This single line quietly undermines systems built on mediation and control, because it suggests that access to the divine is immediate, personal, and unguarded. The same pattern appears in the stories of miracles: water becoming wine, the blind seeing, the dead rising. What if these were not merely physical events meant to inspire awe, but embodied metaphors, lived symbols of inner transformation? Water into wine as the refinement of raw awareness into something luminous. Blindness healed as the awakening of inner sight. Death overcome as the call to rise from spiritual sleep. Read this way, the miracles stop being spectacles and begin to look like invitations. This symbolic language carries a familiarity that is difficult to ignore. It resonates with teachings found far beyond Judea, across cultures that speak of awakening from illusion, of remembering a forgotten spark within. Over time, however, the message hardened. Layers of interpretation narrowed its scope. Jesus was lifted onto a pedestal so high that imitation became impossible. His humanity, his journey, his potential process of learning and struggle were softened or erased. This transformation served a purpose. If he is entirely other, entirely unreachable, then the gap between teacher and follower remains permanent. But if he walked a path open to any sincere seeker, then the implications are far more unsettling. It suggests that the same transformation is not only possible, but intended. That idea has always been dangerous. Within Gnostic traditions, this danger is named. They speak of archons, not as literal monsters, but as forces of distortion, patterns of thought and power that keep human awareness confined. These forces thrive on passivity, on the belief that meaning must be handed down from above. From this perspective, the teachings attributed to Jesus are not comforting reassurances, but acts of resistance. When he speaks of truth setting you free, the freedom implied is not political or social alone. It is existential. Liberation from a false reality that feels solid only because it is never questioned. In this sense, the lost years begin to feel less like a gap and more like a training ground, a period of wrestling with the same tensions that still surface within us today: doubt, fear, the temptation to accept easy answers, the pull of illusion. What if the silence was not peaceful, but demanding? What if those years required confronting the inner landscape most people spend their lives avoiding? The desert, in ancient symbolism, is not just a place of deprivation. It is where distractions fall away, where identity dissolves, where a person encounters themselves without mirrors or applause. If that was part of the journey, then the return is not the arrival of a savior descending from nowhere, but the emergence of someone who has already faced the depths and learned how to speak from them. This reframes the story again, quietly but decisively. The lost years are no longer about where Jesus went. They are about what kind of seeing was cultivated in the absence of recognition. And here, the narrative brushes uncomfortably close to your own life, because everyone has years like this, seasons when nothing seems to move forward, when effort goes unnoticed, when the world offers no confirmation that you are becoming anything at all. These are often labeled as failures or detours, periods to be endured rather than understood. Yet through this lens, they look different. They resemble initiations without ceremony, moments when the outer world withdraws so the inner one can speak. The practices hinted at in ancient traditions do not require temples or vows. They begin with attention, with noticing the patterns that govern your reactions, with recognizing how often fear masquerades as certainty. Purification, in this sense, is not ritual bathing, but the willingness to see what clouds your perception and let it dissolve. Stillness is not withdrawal from life, but learning to hear what remains when noise fades. Seen this way, the teachings stop being relics and become tools, not instructions to follow, but lenses through which to interpret experience. Daily struggles transform into symbols, each one asking to be read rather than resisted. Anger becomes a signpost. Confusion becomes an invitation. Even the feeling of being lost begins to carry meaning. This is not a promise of ease, it is a shift in orientation. Instead of seeking validation from outside, the work turns inward, where the conditions for awakening are already present. The urgency of this realization lies not in fear, but in timing. There are moments when a story stops being theoretical and starts to feel personal, when it presses close enough to ask something of you. The lost years, viewed this way, are not an ancient curiosity. They are a living pattern. They suggest that what feels like stagnation may be formation, and what appears invisible may be sacred. The silence that once seemed empty begins to hum with possibility. And as that hum grows louder, it becomes harder to ignore the sense that this is not just about a figure from the past, but about a choice unfolding now in the quiet spaces of your own life. That quiet hum, once noticed, has a way of changing how you hear everything else. What once felt like an absence begins to feel intentional, almost protective, as if something essential needed time to grow without interruption. This is where the story of Jesus turns fully inward, and where it stops belonging to history alone. Because if the lost years were a crucible rather than a void, then the silence itself was doing the work. It was shaping a way of seeing that could not be taught directly, only lived. And this may be the most unsettling possibility of all, that nothing was missing, that nothing was withheld, that the gap exists precisely because what was formed there could never be adequately written down. When Jesus speaks later of inner freedom, of eyes that see and ears that hear, he is not offering abstractions. He is describing a state of being that emerges after long intimacy with uncertainty. Parables are not puzzles to be solved. They are mirrors. Each listener hears a different truth because each listener stands at a different point in their own inner journey. This is why no final explanation is given, why nothing is systematized. A fixed answer would close the door. Symbol keeps it open. And in that openness lies both the danger and the gift. Institutions crave clarity because clarity can be regulated, ambiguity cannot. A teaching that points inward rather than upward cannot be easily governed. It invites direct experience, and direct experience erodes dependency. This is where the old fear surfaces, not as condemnation, but as tension. If the divine is accessible within, what role remains for intermediaries? If awakening is a process rather than a decree, then authority shifts. It moves away from structures and toward consciousness itself. This is the quiet revolution embedded in the message, one that does not shout, but patiently waits. Over time, the emphasis drifted. The mystery was externalized. Salvation became something administered rather than realized. The human journey was overshadowed by the supernatural figure. The distance widened, and yet traces remained, stubborn and irreducible. Within Gnostic thought, this tension is described not as a battle of good versus evil, but as a struggle between remembering and forgetting. The archons are not demons lurking in shadows, but patterns that keep awareness fragmented. They thrive wherever fear replaces curiosity, wherever certainty replaces inquiry. Against this backdrop, the teachings attributed to Jesus read less like moral instruction and more like disruption. Each parable loosens a thread. Each paradox destabilizes a fixed identity. The invitation is not to believe, but to awaken, to see through appearances and recognize the subtle ways reality is shaped by perception. At this point, the story asks something quietly radical of you. Not agreement, not belief, attention, because once you recognize the pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee it. The lost years stop being an anomaly and start looking like a universal phase. Everyone passes through deserts, whether they name them or not. Periods where meaning dissolves, where direction fades, where old frameworks no longer hold. These moments are often experienced as failure or confusion. But what if they are initiations in disguise? What if they are invitations to shed borrowed identities and listen for something truer beneath the noise? In this light, spiritual practice becomes less about adding something new and more about removing what obscures. Awareness replaces effort. Presence replaces striving. You begin to notice how often your attention is pulled outward, chasing validation, reassurance, certainty, and in noticing, a subtle choice appears. You can continue to measure your worth by external markers, or you can turn inward and ask a different question. What is being formed here, beneath the surface of my life? This is not a dramatic turning point. It is almost disappointingly simple, and yet it is profoundly demanding, because it requires patience with not knowing. The ancient practices hinted at in many traditions converge here, not as rituals to copy, but as orientations to inhabit. Stillness becomes a way of listening rather than escaping. Breath becomes an anchor rather than a technique. Daily experiences become symbols rather than obstacles. Conflict reveals attachment. Loss reveals impermanence. Silence reveals depth. None of this requires withdrawal from the world. It requires a different relationship with it. To be in the world, but not of it, is not a call to separation, but to clarity, to move through life without being consumed by its illusions. This is where the narrative turns fully personal, because if the same light spoken of in ancient texts is not distant, but dormant, then the responsibility shifts. Awakening is no longer something that happens to a chosen few. It becomes a possibility that waits for recognition, and recognition often arrives during the very moments we are taught to dismiss. The years when progress feels stalled, the times when effort yields no applause, the seasons of solitude that feel like being left behind. These are the spaces where formation occurs, unnoticed and uncelebrated. The silence you may be experiencing in your own life is not evidence of abandonment. It may be evidence of depth, of something being shaped slowly enough to last. This reframes urgency in a new way. Not as pressure to act, but as an invitation not to sleepwalk through your own becoming. There is a difference between urgency and haste. One calls you inward, the other scatters you outward. The story of the lost years whispers this distinction again and again. What matters most often unfolds quietly, beyond the reach of spectacle. And so the final revelation is not about where Jesus went or what he studied. It is about what he remembered, about a way of seeing that recognizes the divine, not as an external force to appease, but as an inner reality to awaken. When the story is heard this way, it does not demand belief. It offers resonance. It asks whether something in you recognizes the pattern, whether the silence in your own life might be asking for attention rather than escape. The greatest truths, after all, are rarely delivered as answers. They arrive as questions that refuse to go away. They surface in moments of stillness, in cracks between identities, in the quiet certainty that something essential is trying to be remembered. The lost years were never lost. They were hidden in plain sight, waiting for those willing to see absence as invitation and silence as seed. And once that perspective takes root, the story no longer ends with a figure from the past. It continues, here, now, in the subtle and ongoing work of awakening to what has always been within you. As this reflection gently comes to a close, take a moment to notice what has been moving within you while listening, the quiet recognitions, the questions that did not demand answers, the subtle sense that something familiar was being remembered rather than learned. Nothing you felt along the way was accidental, and nothing stirred because you are late, lost, or behind. The path you are walking unfolds at its own pace, and the season you are in knows exactly what it is doing. What you have just encountered is not meant to be held tightly or solved, but allowed to settle, like dust returning to stillness after being briefly lifted into the light. There is no need to hurry forward or reach for certainty. The silence you may feel now is not a void, but a resting place, a gentle pause where meaning continues to form on its own. If parts of this journey felt personal, that is because they were meant to meet you where you already are, not where you think you should be. You have not been overlooked, and you have not missed your moment. Some understandings arrive slowly, the way dawn arrives, almost unnoticed until the light is already there. When you are ready, there are other reflections waiting nearby, continuing the same quiet thread, offering space to listen a little deeper and to remain with what is unfolding, without force, without urgency, simply allowing the story to keep revealing itself. As you sit with what has just unfolded, you're welcome to let any reflections or questions find their way into the space below, not as answers, but as part of an ongoing conversation. And if this kind of exploration feels like a place you'd like to return to, staying connected through a like or a subscription can simply be a way of walking this path together a little further, at whatever pace feels natural to you.